Between 1947 and 1963, 21 separate individuals accepted contracts to murder Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, the man Harlem knew simply as Bumpy. 21 professional killers, each with documented histories of successful assassinations, each paid substantial sums by various criminal organizations and business interests who wanted Johnson eliminated, each confident in their ability to complete an assignment that dozens before them had failed to finish. 21 assassins entered Harlem with detailed plans, sophisticated weapons, inside information about Johnson's routines and vulnerabilities, and the backing of powerful organizations willing to pay whatever was necessary to see Johnson dead. 21 times, Johnson survived. But survival alone was not what shocked New York's criminal underworld and legitimate power structures. What shocked everyone was not that Johnson lived through 2 decades of sustained assassination attempts, but rather what he did after the 21st failed contract in October 1963, when he emerged from federal prison after serving time for drug trafficking, and discovered that during his incarceration, new contracts had been issued, new killers had been hired, and the campaign to murder him had intensified rather than diminished during his absence. What Johnson did next, the systematic and methodical response he implemented over the following 3 years until his death from natural causes in 1968, fundamentally transformed how organized crime operated in New York City and established principles about respect, retaliation, and the limits of violence that would govern criminal enterprises for generations. The first assassination attempt occurred in June 1947, when Johnson was 42 years old and had recently consolidated control over Harlem's policy operations after driving out Dutch Schultz's organization in the mid-1930s. A gunman named Vincent Calabrese, a professional killer from Philadelphia with 17 confirmed murders to his credit, was paid $15,000 by remnants of Schultz's organization who wanted revenge and wanted Harlem's lucrative numbers racket returned to white control. Calabrese spent 3 weeks in Harlem studying Johnson's routines, identifying when Johnson was most vulnerable, planning an approach that would allow a clean shot and a reliable escape. On a Thursday evening in late June, Calabrese positioned himself in a doorway on 125th Street where Johnson regularly walked after dining at Wells' restaurant. As Johnson approached, walking with his customary unhurried pace, Calabrese stepped from the doorway with a .45 caliber pistol raised, finger on the trigger, certain of success. Johnson moved before Calabrese could fire, not dramatically but efficiently, stepping sideways while simultaneously drawing his own weapon, and shot Calabrese twice in the chest before the assassin could adjust his aim. Calabrese died on the sidewalk before police arrived. Johnson was questioned but not charged. The shooting ruled self-defense after multiple witnesses testified that Calabrese had initiated the confrontation. The lesson Johnson learned from this first attempt was simple. Professional killers would continue coming as long as people were willing to pay for his death. Defending himself reactively would work occasionally, but would eventually fail because probability favored the attackers. One successful shot in 21 attempts would be sufficient to kill him. Johnson needed a different strategy. The second attempt came 4 months later in October 1947. 2 brothers named Michael and Patrick Donnelly, Irish gunmen from Boston, were contracted by a corrupt police official who Johnson had refused to pay increased protection money. The Donnelly brothers were known for patience and planning. They rented an apartment across from Johnson's residence on West 139th Street and spent weeks observing his patterns, waiting for an optimal opportunity. On a Monday morning, as Johnson exited his building to walk to his office, both brothers fired from the apartment window using rifles with telescopic sights. The first shot missed Johnson's head by inches, striking a wall behind him. Johnson dropped to the ground immediately while his bodyguard William Hewlett returned fire toward the apartment window. The second shot hit the sidewalk where Johnson had been standing a moment earlier. By the time police arrived, The Donnelly brothers had fled through a back exit they had prepared for exactly this contingency. They left the city that day and were never seen in New York again. Jonson paid $10,000 to various informants who eventually located the brothers in Chicago. 6 months after the failed assassination attempt, both Donnelly brothers were found dead in their Chicago apartment, killed by unknown assailants who left no evidence connecting the murders to Jonson. The message was clear. Accepting a contract on Bumpy Johnson was not merely dangerous in the moment of the attempt. It carried consequences that would follow the assassin indefinitely until Jonson or his organization achieved retribution. Over the next 16 years, 19 more assassination attempts would occur with remarkable consistency, averaging slightly more than one attempt per year. Some were sophisticated operations involving multiple gunmen, elaborate surveillance, and inside information about Jonson's security arrangements. Others were crude ambushes by inexperienced criminals who underestimated Jonson's awareness and his bodyguard's capabilities. Antonio Russo in 1948 shot from a moving vehicle but missed when Jonson ducked behind a parked car. James McKinley in 1949 attempted poisoning at a restaurant but was identified by one of Jonson's informants before the poison could be administered. Thomas Chen in 1950, hired by Chinese organized crime figures who wanted access to Harlem's gambling operations, attempted a knife attack in close quarters but was killed by Jonson's bodyguard before reaching his target. The attempts continued through the 1950s. Raymond Fuller in 1951, Marcus Williams in 1952. Each assassin was either killed during the attempt or hunted down afterward and eliminated as retribution. Each contract provided Jonson with information about who wanted him dead and why. Sometimes the sponsors were rival criminal organizations seeking to take over his operations. Sometimes they were corrupt police officials angry about Jonson's refusal to pay excessive bribes. Occasionally, they were legitimate businessmen who viewed Jonson as an obstacle to their plans for Harlem real estate development. By 1955, Jonson's reputation for surviving assassination attempts and for methodically hunting down the assassins afterward had become legendary in New York's criminal underworld. Accepting a contract on Bumpy Johnson was considered near suicidal. Professional killers who would take any other assignment refused Jonson contracts regardless of payment offered. This forced contract sponsors to hire increasingly desperate or incompetent assassins, which paradoxically made the attempts less dangerous but more frequent. Carl Henderson in 1956 was an amateur who panicked during the attempt and ran away without firing a shot. Daniel Sullivan in 1957 was drunk during the assassination attempt and shot wildly, hitting a bystander but missing Jonson entirely. Gregory Washington in 1958 was so terrified of Jonson's reputation that he surrendered to police rather than complete the attempt, confessing everything and providing testimony that sent the contract sponsor to prison for conspiracy to commit murder. The attempts in the early 1960s occurred against the backdrop of Jonson's increasing age and his eventual arrest on drug trafficking charges in 1962. Some sponsors assumed Jonson's imprisonment would eliminate him as a factor. Others saw his incarceration as an opportunity to assassinate him while he was confined with limited security. 3 separate attempts occurred in federal prison between 1962 and 1963. All failed. Prison guards were paid to ignore the attacks. Other inmates were recruited to carry out the killings. Each time, Jonson was warned by informants, defended himself successfully, or was protected by inmates loyal to him who valued his reputation and his connections to Harlem's criminal economy. The 21st and final assassination attempt occurred in November 1963, 2 days after Jonson's release from federal prison. A gunman named Charles Whitman, representing a coalition of Italian organized crime families who wanted Jonson eliminated so they could install their own operators in Harlem, fired at Jonson as he walked from the prison release facility to a waiting vehicle. The shot missed. Jonson's bodyguards immediately returned fire, wounding Whitman severely enough that he could not escape. Rather than allowing Whitman to be arrested and questioned by police, which might have revealed the Italian family's involvement, the sponsors arranged for Whitman to receive medical care at a private facility controlled by organized crime. Jonson learned of Whitman's location through his network of informants. 3 weeks after the assassination attempt, Whitman died from what hospital records described as complications from his gunshot wound. People close to the situation understood that complications was a euphemism for deliberate murder disguised as medical failure. Jonson had reached Whitman despite the protection of powerful organized crime families and had eliminated him as he had eliminated the previous 20 assassins. What shocked New York was not this predictable retaliation, but rather what Jonson did next, a strategic response so comprehensive and so revolutionary that it fundamentally changed how criminal organizations throughout the city assessed the costs and benefits of violence. Jonson called a meeting in December 1963, shortly after Whitman's death, assembling approximately 30 people in a Harlem warehouse. The attendees included Jonson's top associates, representatives from other colored criminal organizations, several Italian organized crime figures who maintained business relationships with Jonson, and surprisingly, several legitimate Harlem community leaders including ministers, businessmen, and civil rights activists. The diversity of attendees was itself unusual. Criminals rarely met with legitimate community leaders in formal settings. The meeting lasted 4 hours. Jonson spoke for approximately 30 minutes at the beginning, laying out a proposal that seemed insane to most people hearing it for the first time. Jonson explained that over 16 years, 21 separate individuals had attempted to assassinate him. He had survived every attempt through a combination of awareness, capable bodyguards, good fortune, and ruthless retaliation against the assassins and their sponsors. The cost of this survival, Jonson stated, had been enormous. Not merely the financial costs of maintaining constant security, paying informants, and funding retaliatory operations, but the personal costs of living under perpetual threat, the community costs of violence that endangered innocent bystanders, and the business costs of operating in an environment of constant warfare. Jonson had calculated that defending against 21 assassination attempts and retaliating against 21 assassins and their sponsors had cost his organization approximately $2 million over 16 years. $2 million spent on security and violence rather than on profitable business ventures or community investments. $2 million that represented pure waste, money spent merely to survive rather than to thrive. Jonson's proposal was radical. He would announce publicly that future assassination attempts would not be met with traditional retaliation against the assassins or their sponsors. Instead, Jonson would respond to each assassination attempt by donating $100,000 to Harlem community organizations, churches, schools, civil rights groups, and legitimate businesses. $100,000 per attempt, automatically guaranteed, no matter who sponsored the attempt or what their reasons were. The people at the meeting were stunned. Theodore Green, Jonson's attorney, later recalled that for several minutes after Jonson finished explaining the proposal, nobody spoke because they were trying to process whether they had understood correctly. Finally, one of the Italian organized crime representatives asked the obvious question. "Mr. Jonson, are you saying that if someone tries to kill you, you will respond by giving away $100,000 instead of killing them?" Jonson's response was careful and precise. "No," Jonson said. "I am saying that I will respond by doing both. I will still defend myself during assassination attempts. I will still identify the assassins and the sponsors. But instead of spending $100,000 on retaliatory violence, which is approximately what each retaliation operation has cost over the past 16 years, I will spend that $100,000 on improving Harlem. And I will make certain that everyone in New York, criminal and legitimate, understands that assassination attempts on me now cost the sponsors not just the payment to the assassin, but also a $100,000 contribution to Harlem's community that will be made in the sponsor's name without their permission. Every attempt will be publicized. Every donation will be announced. Every sponsor will be identified publicly as having indirectly contributed to Harlem's improvement through their failed assassination attempt. The strategic brilliance of Jonson's proposal took time to fully appreciate, but eventually became clear to everyone at the meeting. First, the proposal transformed the cost calculation for potential sponsors. Paying an assassin $20,000 to kill Jonson had always carried risks of failure and retaliation. But now it also carried the certainty of contributing $100,000 to Harlem's community and being publicly identified as the indirect sponsor of that contribution. For legitimate businessmen or corrupt officials who occasionally contracted assassinations while maintaining respectable public images, this represented an intolerable outcome. Being publicly named as having indirectly funded community improvements through a failed assassination attempt would reveal their criminal connections and destroy their carefully maintained respectability. Second, the proposal weaponized Harlem's community support for Jonson. Every assassination attempt would now directly benefit the community, turning potential tragedy into automatic improvement funding. Harlem residents, already generally supportive of Jonson because he was a local figure who maintained order and resisted outside control, would become even more protective of him because attempts on his life now translated into resources for churches, schools, and community organizations. Third, the proposal created perverse incentives that undermined the assassination contract market. Professional killers might still accept contracts on Jonson, but they would know that success would trigger not merely standard retaliation against themselves, but also massive public attention to who had sponsored the attempt. Sponsors would become more cautious about contracting Jonson's assassination, knowing that both success and failure carried severe consequences. The initial reactions to Jonson's proposal at the December meeting ranged from skepticism to outright dismissal. Several of his own associates argued he was making himself more vulnerable by announcing he would not retaliate traditionally. The Italian organized crime representatives suggested that abandoning retaliation would be perceived as weakness that would invite more attempts rather than fewer. The community leaders present, while appreciating the promised donations, questioned whether Jonson could actually maintain this policy when faced with serious assassination attempts that endangered his life and his organization. Jonson listened to all objections and responded patiently. To his associates who worried about appearing weak, Jonson explained that he would still defend himself lethally during attempts and would still identify and deal with assassins, but would redirect resources previously spent on elaborate retaliation campaigns toward community investment instead. To the Italian representatives who worried about perceptions of weakness, Jonson noted that surviving 21 assassination attempts over 16 years had already established his reputation for danger and competence. No amount of traditional retaliation would enhance that reputation further, but transforming assassination attempts into community benefits would demonstrate strategic sophistication that traditional violence never could. To the community leaders who questioned his commitment, Jonson wrote checks totaling $500,000 to various Harlem organizations on the spot, stating this was advance payment for 5 assassination attempts he expected would occur over the next few years, and if fewer than 5 attempts occurred, the community would keep the money anyway as a gesture of good faith. Jonson's plan was implemented publicly in January 1964 through announcements in Harlem's colored newspapers and through word-of-mouth networks throughout New York's criminal underworld. The announcement stated simply that Ellsworth Jonson had survived 21 assassination attempts over the previous 16 years, and had decided that future attempts would trigger automatic $100,000 donations to Harlem community organizations made in the name of whoever sponsored the attempt. The announcement included Jonson's calculation that defending against assassination attempts and retaliating against assassins had cost approximately $2 million over 16 years, money he now intended to redirect toward community improvement. The announcement was simultaneously a challenge to potential sponsors and a promise to Harlem that assassination attempts would no longer merely endanger Jonson, but would automatically benefit the community. The criminal underworld's response was mixed. Some saw Jonson's announcement as evidence he had gone soft or had lost his edge during his time in federal prison. Others recognized the strategic sophistication behind the plan and understood that assassination contracts on Jonson had just become dramatically more complicated and more expensive in terms of both financial cost and reputational damage. Legitimate Harlem community leaders responded enthusiastically, recognizing that whether or not assassination attempts actually occurred, Jonson had just committed to being a major community benefactor in ways he had not previously emphasized. The first test of Jonson's new policy came in March 1964, when an assassin named Marcus Wilson attempted to shoot Jonson outside Wells' restaurant on a Saturday evening. Wilson fired 3 shots, all of which missed as Jonson dove behind a parked automobile while his bodyguards returned fire. Wilson was hit multiple times and died at the scene before police arrived. Investigation revealed Wilson had been paid by a corrupt police official named Captain Robert Morrison, who was angry about Jonson's refusal to increase protection payments. Within 48 hours, Jonson's organization had identified Morrison as the sponsor through informants and through financial records connecting Morrison to Wilson. Traditional retaliation would have involved Morrison's assassination, a killing that would be dangerous to execute because Morrison was a police official with colleagues who would aggressively investigate his murder. Instead, Jonson held a press conference on Monday morning, 2 days after the assassination attempt, announcing that $100,000 would be donated to 3 Harlem organizations: Abyssinian Baptist Church, the Harlem YMCA, and a local elementary school, in recognition of Captain Robert Morrison's indirect contribution to Harlem's community through his sponsorship of a failed assassination attempt on Jonson's life. The press conference made headlines throughout New York. Newspapers ran stories about the unusual response to an assassination attempt and about the allegations against Captain Morrison. Morrison was questioned by police internal affairs investigators. His financial records were examined. He was ultimately forced to retire from the police department to avoid criminal prosecution for conspiracy to commit murder. His reputation was destroyed. His career was ended. And he had not been assassinated, which meant police could not investigate his murder and trace it back to Jonson's organization. Morrison's destruction through exposure and public humiliation rather than through violence demonstrated the effectiveness of Jonson's new strategy. Over the next 4 years from 1964 until Jonson's death from natural causes in July 1968, 3 additional assassination attempts occurred. Each attempt failed. Each assassin was either killed during the attempt or soon after. Each sponsor was publicly identified and exposed, their reputations destroyed even when they were not prosecuted criminally. Each attempt triggered the promised $100,000 donation to Harlem community organizations. The cumulative effect was transformative. Harlem residents who might have been indifferent to Jonson's survival became invested in his continued existence, because assassination attempts now translated directly into community resources. Churches, schools, youth programs, and community centers that received donations became inadvertent stakeholders in Jonson's safety. This created a dynamic where information about planned assassination attempts flowed to Jonson from community sources who had not previously served as informants, but who now understood that protecting Jonson meant protecting community resources. The number of assassination attempts declined dramatically after 1964. Between 1947 and 1963, 21 attempts had occurred over 16 years, averaging more than one per year. Between 1964 and 1968, only 3 attempts occurred over 4 years. The reduction was partly due to Jonson's reputation for surviving attempts, and partly due to the increased costs and complications his new policy created for potential sponsors. But the reduction was also due to something more fundamental. Jonson had transformed assassination attempts from purely violent transactions into complex social and economic events with community consequences. Criminal organizations throughout New York observed Jonson's strategy and began adapting their own approaches to conflict resolution. The Italian Mafia, which had frequently used assassination as a management tool for internal disputes and external conflicts, began emphasizing negotiation and arbitration to resolve disagreements that previously would have triggered violence. Not because they had become less willing to kill, but because Jonson had demonstrated that alternatives to violence could be more effective in achieving strategic goals while generating less dangerous attention from law enforcement and media. Colored criminal organizations in Brooklyn, the Bronx, and other New York neighborhoods began implementing similar policies, redirecting resources previously spent on violence toward community investment and reputation management. The shift was gradual and incomplete. Violence certainly did not disappear from New York's criminal underworld, but the frequency of assassinations and violent conflicts decreased measurably during the mid-1960s compared to previous decades. Jonson's policy established principles that influenced organized crime operations beyond New York. Criminal organizations in other cities heard about Jonson's approach through underground networks and through newspaper coverage of his unique response to assassination attempts. Some adopted similar strategies. Others dismissed the approach as specific to Jonson's particular circumstances and reputation. But everyone recognized that Jonson had identified an alternative model for managing conflict that deserved consideration. The model was particularly attractive to older criminal figures who, like Jonson, had survived decades of violence, and who were interested in methods that allowed them to maintain power while reducing personal danger and community collateral damage. Jonson died on July 7, 1968 from a heart attack while eating dinner at Wells' restaurant. He was 62 years old. His funeral was attended by thousands, a mixture of criminals, community leaders, civil rights activists, legitimate businessmen, and ordinary Harlem residents who appreciated that Jonson, despite his criminal activities, had demonstrated loyalty to the community and had transformed what could have been purely destructive conflicts into opportunities for community benefit. The eulogies at Jonson's funeral emphasized different aspects of his life depending on who was speaking. Criminal associates praised his strategic intelligence and his survival through 2 decades of assassination attempts. Community leaders acknowledged his complicated legacy as both criminal and benefactor who had contributed substantially to Harlem institutions. Ministers spoke about redemption and about how even people engaged in criminal activities could find ways to benefit their communities. The common theme throughout the funeral was recognition that Jonson had changed something fundamental about how conflict was managed in Harlem, and had demonstrated that intelligence and strategic thinking could accomplish more than violence alone ever could. The money Jonson donated to Harlem organizations between 1964 and 1968, totaling approximately $300,000 from assassination attempt-triggered donations, plus additional voluntary contributions, funded programs that served the community for years after his death. A youth center named the Jonson Community Center, though officially attributed to Jonson as a community benefactor rather than explicitly to Bumpy Johnson the criminal, operated in Harlem into the 1980s. Scholarships funded by his donations sent dozens of young people to college who might not have had opportunities otherwise. Churches and community organizations that received his support continued programs and services that improved life for thousands of Harlem residents. The question often asked about Jonson's transformation from traditional violent retaliation to community investment in response to assassination attempts is whether the change was genuine moral development or merely sophisticated strategy disguised as community service. The answer, like most questions about complex individuals operating in morally ambiguous circumstances, is probably both. Jonson undoubtedly recognized the strategic advantages of his policy. Redirecting retaliation resources toward community investment created protective networks around him, while simultaneously destroying sponsors' reputations, without the legal and operational risks that came with assassination retaliation. But Jonson also appeared genuinely affected by his time in federal prison, and by his recognition that he had survived 21 assassination attempts more through luck than through invincibility. He was 60 years old in 1963 when released from prison, old enough to contemplate mortality and legacy, old enough to question whether spending the rest of his life merely surviving assassination attempts represented the best use of his remaining years. The community investment policy allowed Jonson to accomplish multiple goals simultaneously: protect himself more effectively than traditional retaliation could, enhance his reputation and standing in Harlem, contribute to community improvement in ways that created lasting benefits, transform his criminal legacy into something more complex than merely successful violence. Whether his motivations were purely strategic or represented genuine desire to benefit the community beyond strategic calculation may be unknowable. What is knowable is that the policy worked. Assassination attempts declined. Jonson's security improved. Harlem received substantial resources. And New York's criminal underworld learned that alternatives to violence could sometimes accomplish strategic goals more effectively than violence itself. The broader implications of Jonson's response to 21 assassination attempts extended beyond criminal organizations to influence how conflicts were managed in other contexts. Civil rights organizations studying Jonson's strategy recognized that transforming attacks into opportunities for community benefit represented a sophisticated approach to asymmetric conflict. When powerful opponents attacked weak but determined groups, responding by publicizing the attacks and using them to generate support and resources could be more effective than direct retaliation. This principle informed various civil rights campaigns during the 1960s, where movement leaders deliberately accepted risks of violence because they understood that attacks on peaceful protesters would generate public sympathy and political pressure more effectively than any violent response protesters might organize. Business organizations studying Jonson's approach recognized applications to corporate competition and public relations. Transforming opponent actions into opportunities for positive publicity represented a sophisticated strategic approach that required intelligence, planning, and discipline, but that could produce outcomes superior to traditional competitive responses. Political organizations recognized that Jonson's policy demonstrated how vulnerable figures could protect themselves through reputation and community support, rather than merely through direct security measures. The lessons from Jonson's experience influenced how various organizations and individuals approached conflict resolution and self-protection for decades after his death. By the time Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, he had survived 21 assassination attempts, killed or arranged the killing of 21 assassins, identified and either eliminated or exposed every sponsor who had contracted his death, and transformed the entire process of assassination contract management in New York's criminal underworld. What shocked New York was not merely his survival, though surviving 21 professional attempts over 16 years was remarkable. What shocked everyone was his decision after the 21st attempt to fundamentally change the rules about how assassination attempts would be handled going forward, to redirect violence toward community benefit, to weaponize generosity as a form of protection, and to demonstrate that strategic intelligence could accomplish more than traditional retaliation ever could. The transformation from violent gangster to sophisticated strategist who protected himself through community investment, while simultaneously benefiting thousands of Harlem residents, represented a remarkable evolution that few people expected, and that changed how organized crime operated throughout New York for generations after Johnson's death.